Hello and welcome to Rainbow Romance. First, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Your support means more than you know, and it gives me the motivation to keep creating meaningful stories for you every day. If you enjoy what you find here, please subscribe, turn on notifications so you never miss a new story, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's begin. Because sometimes the boy everyone believes is everything is the one hiding the most dangerous truth of all. He has no idea who he is when nobody is watching. 3 weeks before the midnight confession that would change everything, 22-year-old Ethan Caldwell stood beneath the bright lights of Westbridge University's Alumni Hall wearing the smile everyone expected from him. At 6'1", with an athletic build, neatly styled golden blonde hair, clear blue eyes, and the polished good looks of an all-American college poster boy, Ethan had spent years becoming exceptionally good at being exactly what other people wanted. Professors loved him. Coaches trusted him. Parents remembered his name. His father introduced him as the future of the Caldwell family, so often that Ethan sometimes wondered whether he was a son or a 5-year business plan. Tonight was no different. Shake hands. Smile. Remember names. Say thank you. Never look tired. Never look uncertain. Never give anyone a reason to ask whether the golden boy might actually be exhausted. Then Ethan heard a quiet laugh from beside the open terrace doors. Mason Cole was leaning against the frame as though the entire formal reception had personally offended him. 23, young and strikingly handsome, Mason had tousled dark brown hair, pale skin, sharp gray eyes, and the effortless confidence Ethan could never manufacture. His black jacket stood out among the navy blazers and pressed white shirts. Mason lifted his soda in Ethan's direction. Nice performance, Caldwell. Ethan's smile tightened. Were you watching me? Hard not to. You're practically glowing. Jealous. Terrified. Mason pushed away from the doorway and walked closer. I keep waiting for someone to unplug you. Ethan laughed despite himself, then immediately hated that Mason had caused it. Mason noticed. Of course he noticed. Those gray eyes lingered on Ethan for one uncomfortable second, as if they had discovered a crack nobody else could see. Then Mason's teasing expression faded. Serious question, he said quietly. Do you even know who you are when nobody's watching? Ethan's practiced smile disappeared. Across the room, his father called his name. Ethan turned automatically toward the voice. When he looked back, Mason was already walking away, hands in his pockets, leaving Ethan with a question that should have been easy to dismiss. It wasn't. And for the first time that night, the golden boy forgot to smile. For the next 3 days, Ethan tried to forget Mason's question. He treated it like every uncomfortable thing in his life. Organize it, bury it, move on. At 7 each morning, he ran 3 miles around campus. At 8, he answered messages from the student leadership committee. By 9, he was sitting in the front row of Professor Whitman's economics seminar, clean notebook open, coffee untouched, looking exactly like a young man whose future had never frightened him. The routine almost worked. Almost. Then Wednesday afternoon, Ethan stepped into the student center and found Mason behind a folding table covered with handwritten flyers. You volunteer? Ethan asked before he could stop himself. Mason glanced up. His dark hair was falling across his forehead, and without the black jacket, he looked younger somehow, less like the campus troublemaker everyone whispered about, and more like an ordinary 23-year-old trying to tape a crooked sign to a cardboard box. Try not to sound devastated. Ethan read the sign. Winter clothing drive. I am surprised. Because bad boys cannot donate sweaters? Because you hate organized activities. Mason smiled. I hate mandatory fun. Charity gets a pass. Ethan should have walked away. Instead, he spent 40 minutes helping Mason sort donated coats. They argued about music, laughed over a truly terrible Christmas sweater, and for a little while Ethan forgot to monitor himself. He laughed too loudly. He sat on the floor. He admitted that he hated black coffee, even though he had been ordering it for years because his father once told him serious men did not need sugar. Mason stared at him. That might be the saddest thing you have ever said. Ethan laughed again. Then his phone rang. Dad. The warmth disappeared so quickly Mason noticed. Ethan stood and answered. Hey, Dad. His voice changed. Straighter. Cleaner. Perfect. His father reminded him about an internship interview, the alumni dinner, the importance of making the right impression. Ethan responded with practiced certainty. Of course. Already handled. Do not worry. When the call ended, Mason was no longer smiling. What? Ethan asked. Mason folded another coat. Nothing. That was definitely something. Mason looked at him then. You sounded like a customer service version of yourself. Ethan felt the words land somewhere tender. You do not know me. I know. Mason's voice softened. That is kind of my point. Ethan grabbed his backpack. Thanks for the psychological evaluation. Anytime, golden boy. Ethan made it halfway to the door before Mason called after him. For what it is worth, I like the guy who puts sugar in his coffee better. Ethan stopped. He did not turn around. Outside, late November sunlight stretched pale gold across the campus sidewalks. Students passed him laughing, talking about Thanksgiving plans and final projects. His phone buzzed again with another reminder, another obligation, another piece of the life he had built so carefully. Ethan stared at his reflection in the dark screen and suddenly remembered Mason asking who he was when nobody was watching. The frightening part was no longer that Mason had asked. The frightening part was that Ethan was beginning to want an answer. By Friday evening, Ethan had almost convinced himself that the conversation at the clothing drive meant nothing. Then he saw Mason again. The campus library was nearly empty, washed in the amber glow of reading lamps while cold rain traced silver lines down the tall windows. Ethan had claimed his usual table near the back, surrounded by color-coded notes, 2 textbooks, and a cup of coffee he had deliberately ordered with sugar. He was halfway through reviewing material for Monday when a chair scraped softly across from him. Mason sat down without asking. That seat is taken, Ethan whispered. Mason glanced at the empty chair beside him. By your personality? Ethan looked down to hide a smile. Do you ever study? Occasionally. It damages my reputation. Mason opened a battered paperback and, strangely, became quiet. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Ethan kept pretending to read, but Mason's presence changed the room. There was no pressure to impress him. Mason did not ask about grades, internships, leadership positions, or Ethan's plans after graduation. He simply existed across the table, turning pages, occasionally pushing his dark hair away from his eyes. Ethan realized how rare that felt. His phone lit up. A message from his mother reminded him about Sunday brunch with a family friend whose company offered prestigious summer internships. Another message followed from his father. Wear the navy blazer. Ethan stared at the screen until the words blurred. You are doing it again, Mason said quietly. Doing what? Leaving. Ethan frowned. I am sitting right here. Mason closed his book. Physically. The answer irritated Ethan because it was accurate. Not everyone gets to wander through life doing whatever they feel like. Mason's gray eyes sharpened. You think that is what I do? Ethan immediately regretted it. Mason leaned back. My scholarship covers tuition, not rent. I work 25 hours a week. I send money home when my mom needs help. But sure, the jacket makes me look carefree. Silence settled between them. Ethan felt heat rise into his face. I did not know. You never asked. Mason said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Ethan closed his notebook. I am sorry. Mason studied him for a moment, then nodded. That sounded real. What does that mean? It means you apologize differently when you are not performing. Ethan exhaled, tired of feeling transparent around him. Why do you keep doing that? Doing what? Looking at me like you know something everyone else missed. Mason's expression softened. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the windows, distant and harmless. Maybe everyone else is too busy admiring you to actually look at you. Ethan forgot how to answer. Mason stood and pulled on his jacket. Come on. Where? Coffee. Ethan glanced at his notes. I have an exam Monday. It is Friday night, Caldwell. You are allowed 30 minutes of bad judgment. 10 minutes later, they were walking beneath the covered arcade toward a 24-hour diner off campus. Ethan had no umbrella. Mason had forgotten his, and both of them were laughing as the wind sent mist beneath the awning. For once, Ethan did not care about his hair, his schedule, or the unread messages vibrating in his pocket. He only noticed how easy breathing felt beside Mason. Then Mason looked over and smiled. There you are. Ethan slowed. What? Mason kept walking. Nothing. But Ethan understood, and that frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The diner sat 3 blocks from campus, squeezed between a laundromat and a closed hardware store, its red neon sign humming against the rainy night. Ethan had passed it hundreds of times and never once gone inside. His father disliked places where the menus were laminated. Mason, naturally, seemed to know everyone. 2 coffees, he told the waitress, sliding into a cracked vinyl booth. Then he glanced at Ethan. 1 with enough sugar to disappoint generations of Caldwells. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. You are never letting that go, are you? Absolutely not. When the coffee arrived, Ethan added 2 packets of sugar and watched them disappear beneath the surface. The tiny act felt absurdly rebellious. Mason noticed, but said nothing. That was becoming the dangerous thing about him. He noticed everything, yet somehow made Ethan feel less observed. They talked about ordinary things at first. Bad movies. Professors with strange habits. The worst jobs they had ever worked. Mason admitted that he once spent an entire summer dressed as a colonial soldier at a tourist attraction in Virginia. Ethan laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. There were knee breeches, Mason said grimly. My dignity never recovered. Then Mason asked, what about you? Ethan searched for something equally embarrassing and found nothing. Every summer had been planned. Leadership programs, internships, training camps, resume builders. Even his vacations had photographs suitable for Christmas cards. I worked at my father's office, he finally said. Mason waited. And what? What did you actually want to do? Ethan stared at him. The diner suddenly seemed too quiet. Rain whispered against the windows. Somewhere behind the counter, silverware clinked against ceramic. I do not know. Mason did not laugh. That is allowed. Ethan looked down at his coffee. Not in my family. The confession came softly, almost accidentally. He told Mason about the internship waiting for him after graduation, about the business degree his father had called practical, about the Sunday dinners where relatives discussed Ethan's future as though he were not sitting at the table. He stopped before saying too much. Mason leaned forward slightly. You know what is weird about you? Ethan gave him a tired smile. Please narrow it down. Everyone thinks you have this enormous ego. Wonderful. But I think you are terrified of taking up any space that was not already assigned to you. Ethan went still. No professor, friend, coach, or relative had ever described him so precisely. He looked toward the rain-darkened window because looking at Mason felt suddenly impossible. You make a lot of assumptions. Then tell me I am wrong. Ethan opened his mouth. Nothing came. Mason did not push. He simply reached across the table and nudged the sugar bowl toward Ethan. Have another. Live dangerously. Ethan laughed, quieter this time, and the tension loosened. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Mason offered to walk him back. They crossed the nearly empty campus beneath glowing street lamps, their shoulders occasionally brushing as the sidewalk narrowed. Neither moved away. At Ethan's residence hall, they stopped beneath the awning. Mason looked at him for a long moment. You were different tonight. Ethan swallowed. Better or worse? Neither. Mason's voice softened. Just more like a person. Ethan should have made a joke. Instead, he stood there listening to his own heartbeat and wondering why being seen by Mason felt more frightening than being judged by everyone else. Then his phone lit up with his father's name. Ethan glanced down for only a second. When he looked up again, Mason's expression had changed. The warmth was still there, but now something guarded stood beside it. Good night, golden boy, Mason said. Ethan watched him disappear into the mist, and for the first time, the nickname did not sound like admiration. It sounded like a warning. Sunday arrived dressed in everything Ethan hated about expectation. Polished shoes, pressed collars, expensive coffee, and conversations that sounded casual while quietly deciding his future. He sat beside his parents at a downtown restaurant overlooking the river, wearing the navy blazer his father had chosen. Across the table, Richard Mercer, an old family friend and senior partner at a consulting firm in Chicago, described a summer position as though Ethan had already accepted it. You would be on the leadership track immediately, Mercer said. Ethan smiled. That sounds like an incredible opportunity. The answer came automatically. His father looked pleased. His mother touched Ethan's arm and said, We always knew you would do something exceptional. There it was again. Exceptional. The word followed Ethan everywhere like a shadow dressed as a compliment. His phone vibrated beneath the table. A message from Mason waited on the screen. Coffee emergency. The diner has replaced our terrible sugar packets with even worse ones. Ethan stared at it, and a smile escaped before he could stop it. Someone interesting? His mother asked. Ethan locked the screen. Just a friend. The lie was technically harmless. Mason was a friend. Probably. Yet something about saying it made Ethan feel as though he had closed a door. By Monday afternoon, he found Mason outside the arts building helping a freshman repair a presentation board that had collapsed in the wind. Mason was kneeling on the sidewalk, holding tape between his teeth while the student laughed. Ethan stopped several feet away. This was the version of Mason people rarely talked about. Patient, unshowy, kind when nobody important was watching. When the student finally left, Mason spotted Ethan. Caldwell, did you come to inspect my community service record? I came to apologize. Mason raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Ethan shoved his hands into his coat pockets. For Friday, my father called, and I disappeared without actually leaving. Mason's teasing expression faded. You noticed? I noticed more things lately. Dangerous habit. They began walking toward the quad. Bare branches moved gently above them, and students hurried past carrying backpacks and paper cups. Ethan told Mason about brunch, the internship, Chicago, the future everyone seemed to have approved without consulting him. Do you want it? Mason asked. Ethan almost gave the responsible answer. Instead, he said, I do not know. Mason nodded as though uncertainty were not a failure. That simple acceptance made Ethan's chest feel strangely lighter. What would you do? Ethan asked. If everyone expected you to become someone you were not sure you wanted to be. Mason considered it. Disappoint them? Ethan laughed. Of course you would. I did. Mason's smile disappeared. My family wanted safe choices. I made my own. It cost me some relationships. Ethan looked at him. Was it worth it? Mason was quiet for several steps. Ask me again when I am 40. Ethan smiled. Mason bumped his shoulder lightly against Ethan's. The contact lasted less than a second, but Ethan felt it long afterward. They reached the stone steps outside Ethan's residence hall and stopped. Neither seemed eager to leave. Mason looked at him with that unsettling steadiness again. You do not have to figure out your whole life this week. Ethan exhaled. Tell my father. Give me his number. Absolutely not. Mason grinned, and Ethan laughed. For one suspended moment, everything felt easy. Then Mason's gaze dropped briefly before returning to Ethan's eyes. The humor between them softened into something quieter. Ethan became intensely aware of the small distance separating them. He could have stepped back. Mason could have looked away. Neither did. Ethan's phone rang. His father's name illuminated the screen between them like a command. Ethan instinctively reached for it. When he looked up, Mason had already taken one step back. You should answer, Mason said. Ethan heard the distance in his voice. Mason, wait. But Mason only gave him a small, unreadable smile. It is okay, golden boy. I know which version of you gets priority. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Ethan beneath the cold afternoon sky with the phone still ringing in his hand. For the first time in years, Ethan let his father's call go unanswered. The ringing stopped, leaving only the distant noise of campus and the uncomfortable silence inside his own head. He should have felt guilty. Instead, he felt angry, and the anger surprised him because it was not really directed at his father. It was directed at himself. Mason had been right. Again, Ethan hated how often that happened. By Tuesday, Mason seemed to have mastered the art of being everywhere without ever being available. Ethan saw him outside the library, across the quad, and laughing with friends near the student center, but Mason never stayed long enough for a real conversation. Then Wednesday evening, Ethan spotted him at a campus coffee house sitting across from a handsome guy Ethan vaguely recognized from the theater department. The stranger said something that made Mason laugh, and an ugly little feeling twisted beneath Ethan's ribs. He immediately resented it. Mason was allowed to have friends. Mason was allowed to laugh with whoever he wanted. Ethan ordered coffee he did not want and sat 15 feet away pretending to read. 5 minutes later, Mason appeared beside his table. You know the book is upside down, right? Ethan looked down. It was. I was thinking. Mason glanced toward his abandoned table. Aggressively, apparently. Ethan closed the book. Who is he? Mason blinked. Who? The guy you were sitting with. A slow smile appeared. Are you asking because you are curious? Or because you have been staring at us for 10 minutes? I was not staring. Your upside-down textbook says otherwise. Ethan felt his face warm. Forget it. He stood, but Mason's expression changed from amused to thoughtful. His name is Tyler. We are working on the Winter Arts fundraiser. I did not ask for his resume. You literally asked who he was. Ethan grabbed his coat. This conversation was a mistake. Mason followed him outside. Cold air swept across the sidewalk, carrying the smell of rain and fallen leaves. Ethan. He stopped. Mason rarely used his first name. What? Why do you care? The question was simple. Ethan wished it were not. I do not. Mason's face closed slightly. There he is. Who? Golden boy. Ethan exhaled sharply. Stop calling me that. Then stop hiding behind him. Something inside Ethan cracked. You think everything is easy because you do not have to answer to anyone. Mason's eyes hardened. We already established that is not true. I know. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. I know, and I am sorry. The sentence failed him. Mason waited. That was worse than interruption. I do not know what you want from me. Mason stepped closer, not threatening, simply refusing to let distance finish the conversation. Nothing. That is not true. Fine. I want you to stop saying one thing with your mouth while your face says something completely different. Ethan stared at him. The campus seemed to recede around them. And what exactly is my face saying? Mason held his gaze for a long second. That is something you need to figure out. Then he walked away. Ethan stood beneath the street lamp, watching Mason disappear toward the arts building. His phone buzzed. His father again. This time Ethan barely noticed. Because suddenly the question consuming him was not why Mason had been laughing with Tyler. It was why seeing it had felt like losing something Ethan had never admitted he wanted. By Thursday night, Ethan had stopped pretending the problem was Mason. Mason was only the mirror. The real problem was what Ethan kept seeing in it. He sat alone in his residence hall room with his laptop open to an unfinished internship application and his father's latest message glowing on his phone. Richard Mercer needs your confirmation by Friday morning. Do not let this opportunity disappear. Ethan read the words until they stopped looking like advice and started looking like instructions. Chicago. Consulting. Leadership track. A respectable future assembled so neatly that there was barely enough room inside it for Ethan himself. He closed the laptop. 10 minutes later, he was walking across campus with no destination, hands buried in his coat pockets against the cold. The clock tower showed 11:47 when he noticed lights spilling from the student center. Inside, volunteers were finishing preparations for the winter fundraiser. Through the glass doors, Ethan saw Mason carrying a box of decorations toward the lobby. Mason saw him too. For a moment, neither moved. Then Mason set the box down and stepped outside. You look terrible, he said. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. Thank you. I mean unusually terrible. Much better. Mason leaned against the brick wall beneath the awning. What happened? Ethan almost said nothing. The word reached his throat, polished and automatic. He swallowed it. I am supposed to accept an internship tomorrow. Do you want it? Everyone keeps asking me that. Maybe because you keep answering a different question. Ethan looked at him. What does that mean? You always tell people whether something is smart, impressive, responsible, useful. You never say whether you want it. Ethan stared across the empty quad. What if I do not know what I want? Mason's voice softened. Then start with what you do not want. The answer landed harder than Ethan expected. He did not want another summer chosen for him. He did not want every decision measured against his father's approval. He did not want to keep smiling whenever he felt trapped. And suddenly, painfully, he knew one more thing. He did not want Mason walking away from him. Tyler, Ethan said. Mason blinked. What about him? I hated seeing you with him. Mason became very still. Ethan laughed nervously and looked away. That sounded worse out loud. No, it sounded clearer. I was jealous. The admission seemed enormous in the quiet. Mason did not rescue him from it. He simply waited. Ethan's heart beat faster. I kept telling myself I was annoyed because you get under my skin. Then I thought maybe I just liked arguing with you. Then I started drinking coffee with sugar because of one stupid conversation, and somehow that felt more honest than half the decisions I have made this year. Mason's expression softened, but Ethan was already past the point where he could stop. When you leave, I notice. When you laugh with someone else, I notice. When my phone rings while I am with you, I hate answering because for those few minutes before it rings, I feel like I belong to myself. Mason took a quiet breath. Ethan finally met his eyes. I care because I want it to be me. Silence. No applause. No perfect response. Only the cold midnight air and Mason standing close enough that Ethan could see the surprise beneath his guarded expression. Ethan, Mason said carefully, Do you understand what you are telling me? Ethan's voice shook, but he did not look away. For once, I think I do. Mason stepped closer, his gray eyes searching Ethan's face. Then prove it. Ethan frowned. Mason's voice was gentle, but there was something wounded beneath it. Do not tell me when campus is empty and nobody can hear you. He paused. Tell me tomorrow, when being honest is harder. Then Mason turned toward the doors, leaving Ethan alone beneath the awning with the first truth he had ever chosen for himself, and the terrifying realization that saying it had only been the beginning. Morning arrived with no mercy. Ethan had slept for less than 3 hours, and by 8:30 he was sitting in the campus cafe, staring at a blueberry muffin he had forgotten to eat. Mason's words had followed him through the night. Tell me tomorrow, when being honest is harder. Ethan had imagined a dozen versions of what that meant, and every version ended with people watching. His phone buzzed. His father, then his mother, then Richard Mercer's assistant asking for confirmation about Chicago. Ethan turned the phone face down. Very mature, a voice said. Ethan looked up. Mason stood beside the table holding a coffee. He looked tired too, though his expression gave nothing away. I am practicing avoidance, Ethan said. You are gifted. Mason sat across from him. For several seconds, neither mentioned the night before. Around them, students hurried between classes, chairs scraped against tile, and an espresso machine hissed like it had opinions. Everything was painfully normal. Ethan finally said, about last night. Mason's fingers tightened slightly around his cup. You do not owe me a performance. You told me to prove it. I told you not to make me something that only exists after midnight. Ethan went quiet. Mason looked toward the window. I have done that before, Ethan. Been important to someone in private and inconvenient in daylight. There was no accusation in his voice, only an old exhaustion that made Ethan understand why the test mattered. I am not asking you to announce anything to the campus. I am asking whether you become a different person when somebody might judge you. Ethan swallowed. I do. Mason looked back at him. Ethan forced himself not to soften the truth. I have been doing it my entire life. I know, and I do not know how to stop overnight. Mason's expression gentled. I know that too. Before Ethan could answer, someone called his name. 2 members of the student leadership committee approached, followed by Tyler from the arts fundraiser. Tyler greeted Mason easily, then glanced between them with a knowing smile. Did you two finally stop pretending you hate each other? Ethan froze. It was harmless teasing. Everyone laughed except Ethan. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. Shoulders straight. Smile ready. Golden boy, reporting for duty. Mason and I are just. He stopped. Mason did not move, but something in his eyes retreated. Ethan heard the unfinished word between them. Friends. Nothing. A misunderstanding. Any answer could restore the familiar world in 1 second. His phone buzzed again on the table, his father's name bright against the screen. Ethan looked at it, then at Mason. We are figuring that out, he said. The sentence was small. Imperfect. But it was true. Tyler smiled. Fair enough. The conversation moved on as casually as it had begun. No catastrophe followed. Nobody gasped. The ceiling remained exactly where it was. Yet Mason watched Ethan differently. Later, outside the cafe, Mason caught up with him beneath a pale winter sky. That was not what I expected. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets. Neither did I. You looked terrified. I was terrified. Mason smiled faintly. And Ethan considered the question. And apparently the world survived. Mason laughed, quiet and warm. Ethan felt something loosen inside him. Then his phone rang once more. This time he answered. Dad, I need to talk to you about Chicago. Mason started to step away, but Ethan reached out and briefly caught his wrist. Stay. Mason looked down at Ethan's hand, then back at his face. Ethan released him, suddenly self-conscious. Mason did not leave. For the first time, Ethan faced his father's expectations with someone beside him who was not asking him to be brave, impressive, or perfect. Mason was simply there, and somehow, that made honesty feel possible. For several seconds after Ethan answered, his father said nothing. The silence was worse than anger because Ethan had spent his entire life learning how to fill it with whatever answer would restore approval. I am not accepting Chicago today, Ethan said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Why? His father finally asked. Ethan looked across the courtyard. Mason stood several feet away, deliberately studying a bulletin board to give him privacy while still keeping his promise to stay. Because I do not know if it is what I want. Another silence. Ethan, opportunities like this do not wait for people to discover themselves. The familiar guilt arrived immediately. Ethan pictured Sunday brunch, Richard Mercer, his mother's proud smile, every carefully arranged step toward a future everyone understood. I know. Then what exactly are you doing? Ethan closed his eyes. Normally, that question would have sent him scrambling for the correct answer. This time, he allowed himself not to have one. I am trying to figure that out before I spend 10 years becoming someone I never chose. His father exhaled slowly. This does not sound like you. Ethan opened his eyes and found Mason watching him now. Not smiling, not encouraging, just there. Maybe that is the problem, Ethan said. The conversation ended without resolution. No blessing, no dramatic rejection, just his father saying they would discuss it later, which somehow felt more frightening because later meant Ethan would have to remain the person who had finally said no. He lowered the phone. How bad? Mason asked. Ethan considered it. I think I just disappointed my father for the first time. Congratulations. Ethan stared at him. Mason lifted both hands. Sorry. Terrible timing. A laugh escaped Ethan anyway, shaky and exhausted. You are impossible. And yet you asked me to stay. They walked without deciding where they were going, eventually reaching the old pedestrian bridge beyond campus. Below them, the river moved dark and slow beneath the gray December sky. Ethan rested his hands on the cold railing. Last night, when you told me to prove it, I thought you wanted some huge public declaration. Mason leaned beside him. That sounds horrifying. It does. For both of us. Ethan smiled faintly, then grew serious. What do you want? Mason watched the water. Honesty when it is inconvenient. The words were simple enough to hurt. I do not need you to turn your life into a statement. I just cannot be the person you reach for in private and erase when someone important walks into the room. Ethan looked at him. Beneath Mason's confidence was something quieter, a bruise made of memory rather than injury. Someone did that to you. Mason did not answer immediately. A long time ago. Ethan wanted details, but Mason's expression told him not yet. So Ethan did something unfamiliar. He respected the silence. Their shoulders rested lightly against each other as they watched the river. No confession followed. No promise. The moment was smaller than that, and somehow more important. That evening, however, the fragile calm disappeared. Ethan arrived at the winter fundraiser to find the alumni hall crowded with students, faculty, donors, and several people his parents knew. Mason was across the room adjusting a display with Tyler. Ethan had barely taken off his coat when his mother approached, visibly relieved to see him. Your father told me about Chicago, she said quietly. We are worried. Before Ethan could respond, her gaze moved across the room and stopped on Mason. Something in Ethan's face must have betrayed him because his mother looked back at him with sudden curiosity. Ethan, she asked, is there something else going on? Across the hall, Mason glanced up. Their eyes met. Ethan felt the old machinery inside him begin to turn, smile, deflect, protect, perform. And for one terrible second, he did not know which version of himself was going to answer. Ethan knew exactly what the old version of himself would have done. Smile. Laugh softly. Tell his mother she was imagining things. Redirect the conversation toward the fundraiser, Chicago, anything safe. He could almost hear the answer forming. Instead, he looked across the crowded alumni hall at Mason. Under the warm lights, Mason stood beside Tyler with his dark hair slightly messy and his sleeves pushed toward his elbows, looking nothing like the polished future Ethan's family had designed for him. Mason caught his gaze but did not smile. He was waiting without asking Ethan to perform. There is, Ethan finally told his mother. Her expression changed. Not anger. Surprise. Somehow that made the moment harder. Can we talk about it later? Ethan asked. She studied him carefully. Of course. Relief came too quickly. Ethan hated himself for feeling it. Then his father arrived beside them with Richard Mercer, and within seconds Ethan was trapped inside another conversation about Chicago. Richard smiled warmly. I hear you are having second thoughts. Ethan glanced toward Mason. Tyler had said something, but Mason was no longer listening. His attention remained fixed across the room. I am thinking about what I actually want, Ethan said. His father shifted beside him. Ethan is simply being cautious. There it was. An exit. A beautiful, respectable explanation. Ethan could take it, and nobody would know how uncertain he really was. Richard nodded. Nothing wrong with caution. Your father tells me you have always been unusually focused. He has, Ethan's mother said. Ever since he was little. Compliments gathered around him like walls. Focused. Reliable. Exceptional. Ethan smiled because his body remembered how, even while something inside him went quiet. Then Tyler approached to thank the Caldwells for their donation. Mason came with him carrying a stack of programs. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, this is Mason Cole, Tyler said. He basically kept this fundraiser alive. Ethan's mother smiled. Mason, I have heard your name. Ethan's stomach dropped. Mason's eyes flicked toward him. His father noticed. From Ethan? The question sounded harmless. It was harmless. That was what made Ethan's hesitation unbearable. 2 seconds. Maybe less. But in those 2 seconds, every fear returned at once. His father's expectations, his mother's curiosity, Richard Mercer standing 3 feet away, the future waiting for Ethan to remain recognizable. We have worked on a few campus things together, Ethan said. The words were technically true. They were also cowardly. Mason's face barely changed. That hurt more than anger would have. Right, Mason said. Campus things. Tyler glanced between them, suddenly uncomfortable. Ethan wanted to correct himself, but his father had already turned the conversation back toward Chicago. By the time Ethan looked again, Mason was gone. He found him 10 minutes later near the coat check, pulling on his black jacket. Mason. Mason kept fastening the zipper. You do not have to explain. I hesitated. I noticed. My father was standing there. Mercer was there. Everything happened at once. Mason finally looked at him. There was no accusation in his gray eyes. Only disappointment softened by understanding. Somehow that was worse. That is the point, Ethan. It will always happen at once. Ethan went still. Mason lowered his voice. There will always be a father, a job, a room full of people. Some reason tomorrow would be easier. I am trying. I know. Mason's answer was gentle. But I cannot become another thing you hide until you feel brave enough. Ethan felt panic rise. So that is it. I fail one test, and you leave. Something flickered across Mason's face. You still think this is a test about me? Before Ethan could ask what he meant, Mason stepped toward the doors. Go back to your family. Ethan watched him leave beneath the glowing exit sign, and suddenly understood the cruelest part of perfection. You could spend your entire life giving everyone the right answer, and still lose the one person who needed the truth. Ethan did not follow Mason. For once, instinct told him that chasing someone down the sidewalk with another desperate explanation would only turn honesty into another performance. Instead, he returned to the alumni hall and stood near the edge of the crowd while applause rose for the fundraiser organizers. The room looked different now. Same warm lights, same polished tables, same familiar faces. Yet Ethan suddenly saw how much of his life had been arranged around being witnessed. His father approached first. Everything all right? The question carried genuine concern, which made Ethan's resentment harder to hold. No, Ethan said. His father blinked. Ethan almost laughed. Apparently one honest word could be more shocking than an entire rebellion. His mother joined them, her expression careful. Is this about Mason? Ethan looked toward the doors Mason had disappeared through. Partly. His father frowned. Who is Mason to you? There it was. The question Ethan had failed to answer minutes earlier. His heart began its familiar race, but this time he did not search for the safest sentence. Someone I care about. His mother's eyes softened. His father remained silent. Ethan continued before fear could edit him. But this is bigger than Mason. Chicago, my major, every committee, every plan. I keep saying yes because I know how proud it makes everyone. His father started to speak, but Ethan shook his head. Please. I need to finish one sentence without figuring out how everyone will feel about it. The words surprised all 3 of them. Ethan breathed slowly. I do not know what I want yet. That scares me. But I know I cannot keep choosing things just because they make me easy to be proud of. His father's face tightened with something Ethan could not immediately read. Disappointment, perhaps. Or fear. His mother reached for his hand. Ethan, we were never asking you to be miserable. I know. That was the painful truth. There was no villain in the room. His parents had built expectations out of love, and Ethan had turned them into rules because rules were easier than uncertainty. His father looked away, then quietly said, "I thought giving you a path would make things easier." Ethan swallowed. It did, until I forgot I was allowed to leave it. Silence settled between them, but this time Ethan did not rush to repair it. Later, after the fundraiser ended, he walked alone toward the residence halls. The air had turned sharply cold, and the campus was nearly empty. He passed the coffee house where jealousy had exposed him, the library where Mason had first accused him of disappearing, and finally the pedestrian bridge where Mason had said he wanted honesty when it was inconvenient. Ethan stopped halfway across. Only then did he understand. Mason had never asked him to make a public declaration. He had never demanded proof of affection. He had asked Ethan to stop abandoning himself whenever somebody important entered the room. The test was not whether Ethan could choose Mason in front of everyone. It was whether Ethan could remain Ethan when choosing anything carried a cost. His phone vibrated. A message from Richard Mercer asked whether he had reached a decision about Chicago. Ethan stared at it for several seconds, then typed carefully, "Thank you for believing in me, but I am not ready to accept a future simply because it looks impressive from the outside. I need time to decide what fits the life I actually want." He sent it before he could rewrite himself into obedience. Then he opened Mason's contact. His thumb hovered over the screen. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain everything he had finally understood. Instead, he typed only one sentence. "You were right. I thought you were asking me to prove that I wanted you, but you were asking me to stop pretending I did not want anything." The message showed as delivered. No answer came. Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket and looked across the dark river. For the first time, Mason's silence did not feel like a punishment. It felt like a boundary. And if Ethan truly cared about him, he would have to learn the difference. By Saturday morning, Ethan still had no reply from Mason. The silence followed him through breakfast, through a long walk around campus, and into the student leadership meeting he had nearly forgotten. A month earlier, he would have interpreted silence as failure and immediately tried to fix it. Now he forced himself to sit with uncertainty. Mason had asked for honesty, not persuasion. When the meeting ended, Ethan was gathering his notes when Professor Whitman stopped beside him. "I heard you decline Mercer's offer." Ethan looked up, surprised by how quickly news traveled among people who considered networking a recreational activity. "I did. Your father mentioned you were reconsidering your plans." Ethan braced himself for disappointment. Instead, Whitman smiled. "Good." Ethan blinked. "Good. You are 22, Caldwell. If you already knew exactly who you were supposed to become, I would be concerned." Ethan laughed softly. The comment stayed with him all afternoon. Maybe uncertainty was not evidence that something had gone wrong. Maybe uncertainty was simply space. That evening, the university hosted the final reception for the winter fundraiser. Ethan considered skipping it because Mason would probably be there. Then he realized avoiding the room would be another version of hiding. So he went. Mason stood near the donation display, talking with Tyler and several volunteers. He saw Ethan enter. Their eyes met. Mason gave a small nod, nothing more. Ethan returned it. No chasing, no dramatic confrontation. He spent the next hour helping guests, carrying boxes, and speaking to people without checking whether Mason was watching. Near the end of the evening, Richard Mercer appeared unexpectedly. "Ethan," he offered a cordial smile. "I received your message. I hope I did not waste your time." "You did not. But I admit your father made it sound like someone had influenced your decision." Ethan knew exactly where the assumption came from. His gaze moved briefly toward Mason. Richard followed it. "The young man from the other night?" Before Ethan could answer, his father approached. "Richard, this is not the place." The old Ethan would have welcomed the rescue. The new one understood what it cost. "Actually, it is fine." Ethan's father looked at him carefully. Ethan continued. "Mason did influence me, but not the way you mean." Across the room, Mason had gone still. He asked questions I should have been asking myself years ago. The decision about Chicago was mine. Richard nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Ethan turned toward his father. "And whatever you think about the choices I make next, please do not blame him for them." The room did not fall silent. Nobody turned dramatically. Most people never even noticed. That was strangely liberating. Ethan had spent years imagining judgment as a spotlight, only to discover that most people were busy living their own lives. His father studied him, then looked toward Mason. "I may have underestimated how much pressure you felt." Ethan swallowed. "I may have underestimated how much of it I put on myself." His father nodded once. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was honest. For now, that was enough. When Ethan looked across the room again, Mason was gone. Tyler was collecting empty cups alone. Ethan approached him. Did Mason leave? Tyler nodded toward the doors. A few minutes ago. Ethan felt disappointment, but not panic. Did he say where he was going? Tyler smiled slightly. No, but if I were looking for him, I would try the place where people go when they need to think. Ethan knew immediately. He stepped outside into the cold night and headed toward the pedestrian bridge. Halfway there, his phone finally vibrated. Mason had replied with 5 words. I heard what you said. Ethan stopped beneath a street lamp, breath visible in the winter air. Another message appeared. This time, come find me. Ethan found Mason halfway across the pedestrian bridge, standing beneath the old iron lamp where they had talked only days earlier. The river below reflected scattered city lights, broken into trembling ribbons by the current. Mason had his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, dark hair moving slightly in the winter wind. He turned when Ethan approached. You came. Ethan stopped beside him, catching his breath. You told me to find you. You usually follow instructions well. Ethan laughed. I'm trying to recover from that. Mason smiled, and some of the tension between them finally loosened. For a moment, they simply stood together. Ethan had imagined this conversation all afternoon, constructing speeches in his head, revising every sentence until each one sounded perfect. Now none of them seemed useful. I am sorry, he said. Mason looked at him. I know. Not just for the fundraiser. For making you feel like something I needed to hide. Mason's expression softened. Thank you. Ethan rested his hands on the cold railing. I thought your test was about whether I could choose you in front of people. It was never supposed to be a test. You literally told me to prove it. Mason winced. That was dramatic. Very. It was after midnight. People make questionable speeches after midnight. Ethan smiled. Then Mason grew serious. I did not need you to announce anything, Ethan. I needed to know that when someone asked who I was to you, you would not erase whatever was happening between us just to make the room comfortable. Ethan nodded. I understand now. Mason looked toward the river. Someone I cared about once made me feel like I mattered only behind closed doors. I promised myself I would never do that again. Ethan did not ask for more. He moved slightly closer, their shoulders almost touching. I cannot promise I will suddenly stop being afraid. Good. Ethan glanced at him. Mason shrugged. That would be suspiciously fast character development. Ethan laughed, the sound carrying across the empty bridge. I can promise something else, he said. I will stop treating fear like an instruction. Mason turned toward him. The humor faded from his face, replaced by something warmer. That sounds more like you. Ethan swallowed. I am still figuring out who that is. I know. What if you do not like the answer? Mason considered him for a long moment. Then we figure that out honestly too. No grand promise. No guarantee. Somehow Ethan trusted it more because of that. He reached out, hesitated, then offered his hand. Mason looked down at it with an amused smile. Very formal. I am improvising. Terrifying. Mason took his hand anyway. Their fingers settled together, warm against the December cold, and Ethan felt no fireworks, no miraculous transformation, only an unfamiliar quiet inside himself. Relief. They began walking back toward campus without letting go. Over the following weeks, Ethan changed in ways small enough that most people barely noticed. He switched one class he had hated. He told his mother when he was tired instead of saying he was fine. He drank his coffee with 2 sugars in public. His father stopped sending internship listings every morning and started asking questions instead. Mason never became Ethan's escape from responsibility. He became the person beside whom Ethan learned responsibility could include responsibility to himself. One evening near the end of the semester, they returned to the diner. Mason pushed the sugar bowl across the table. Still disappointing generations of Caldwells. Ethan poured 2 packets into his coffee. With increasing confidence. Mason smiled. Ethan looked at him across the scratched table, at the young man who had never asked him to become less ambitious, less capable, or less complicated. Mason had only asked him to become less absent from his own life. For years, Ethan had believed being loved meant giving people a version of himself they could admire. Sitting there beneath cheap diner lights with Mason laughing across from him, he finally understood something simpler. Being seen was quieter than being admired. It was also infinitely warmer. And for the first time in his life, Ethan did not need to be golden. He only needed to be Ethan.